Page 20 and 21. Let's move on to the next section now, which is titled Seventh Chords. Now, seventh chords can take quite a considerable amount of time if you're taking college theory. You can easily be studying seventh chords for a couple of months. However, I'm going to explain it to you by giving you 3 simple patterns to go from. Then you'll be able to find the 3 most common seventh chords in music very simply. So bear with me. This is real simple. Let's get right into it. Now, using C as an example, we learn to build a tetrachord plus a whole step pattern and come up with 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now, whenever we played 1, 3, and 5 together, it was pretty simple. It was a major triad, right? And when we lowered the third of that chord, it became a minor triad. Okay, now why do they call it a triad, by the way? Well, just remember, a tricycle has 3 wheels, doesn't it? A triad has 3 notes, either major or minor. If you're using 1, 3, and 5, it's called a triad. Now let's dig in a little further. Okay, let's go back to the C major triad just for example's sake. C, E, and G. Now let's add a note that is a whole step below the root. Okay, so I'm going to have to move my thumb out of the way. Add a note that's a whole step below the root. Listen to that. So I've got a B flat now, a C, an E, and a G. I want to give you just a little hand position pointer here. Did you notice that when I did that, I scooted my hand in? These keys are nice and long, and the reason they made it so long is if you were playing the triad in this position, and then you needed to play the B flat with it, your thumb doesn't reach. Oh no, I need a longer thumb. It's really funny, but I just always remind people, hey, scoot your hand in. Okay, so learn to scoot your hand in when you're playing some of these flat notes, okay? Now, guess what? We just formed the A number 1 most common 7th chord in music. This is called a dominant 7th chord, okay? We started with a C major triad. We added a note a whole step below. That's called a dominant 7th chord. Now, you're probably wondering why. Why are you calling it a 7th chord? Well, I'm going to show you that in just a bit. But just remember, for now, to make a dominant 7th chord, take a major triad and add a note 1 whole step below. Now, that note is B flat. I'm going to go all the way back to the beginning of this course for a second. Do you remember when I said there's lots of C's and lots of E's and lots of G's on the piano? And I told you that you can play these parts of the chords anywhere you want. Well, let's say that this B flat, let's say you want to play it up on top. That's still a C dominant 7 chord. Okay, but the easiest way to find that note is to play the C major triad, play a note a whole step below. You can play it anywhere you want now. Let's build an E dominant 7th chord. First we find an E major triad. Okay, and a whole step below E is D. Okay, so you've got an E dominant 7. Now, lots of times it won't be written as E dominant 7. It'll just be written as E7. That's kind of a shorthand in music. So when you see E7, you know they mean E dominant 7. Now you could play that dominant 7th, you could play it up here, right? Or you could play it in your left hand. Okay, so already we've learned how to create the dominant 7th chord, which is the first of the 3 most common types of 7th chords in music. Let's go on now to the second of the 3 most common 7th chords. This 7th chord is called a minor 7th chord. Now, to build a minor 7th chord, we need to start with a minor triad. For example's sake, let's start with G this time. Okay, there's G major. You know how to turn that into G minor. Okay, again, to build the minor 7th chord, we have to start with a minor triad. Okay, now if we add a note, again, that's a whole step below the root. There it is. Kind of a pretty voicing of that chord with the 7th and the root against each other. Let's build a B minor 7th chord. But it's real simple. Start with a B minor triad. There's B major. Make it minor. Add a note a whole step below the root. Whether you add that 7th in your left hand or you add it up here. That's kind of an old barber shop way to add it, is kind of stacked up on top like that. Here's the last of the 3 most common 7th chords. It's called a major 7th chord. Now, a major 7th chord is built by playing a major triad, using C as an example again, and adding a note that's a half step below the root. So that's an interesting sounding voicing, isn't it? See how the root and the major 7th are kind of fighting right there? This sounds particularly nice up high, like this. Isn't that nice? Now remember I said you could play these parts of chords anywhere you wanted on the piano? Let's take this high G and put it right there instead. Okay, so we'll take it off the top. Whoop. Now we're going to put it on the bottom. We're going to move our fingers. Guess what? We still have a C major 7 chord because we have the notes of C major 7, but now we did something called inverting them down. That means taking the same notes and just putting them in a different order. That's a whole new technique, isn't it? Learning to invert a chord. That's a powerful technique. Let's invert this again. How about this E on top? Let's put it down on the bottom. Okay, so we got to move all our hand. Right? Okay, so now this sounds really nice with the root down low. That's it. We learned how to find the 3 most common 7th chords. The dominant 7th, the minor 7th, and the major 7th chords. In addition, we also learned a little bit about inverting chords, putting the notes in different orders, but retaining the same notes. It's called inverting a chord. Now, I promised to explain to you why these chords are called 7th chords. But first, let's talk about how the chords are written. A dominant 7th chord, like C dominant 7, is simply written C7. A minor 7th chord, like C minor 7, is simply written C lowercase m 7. And lastly, a major 7th chord, like C major 7, is written C uppercase m 7. Let's quickly look at why these are called 7th chords. Remember our tetrachord plus a whole step pattern? This pattern is actually just the first 5 notes of something called the major scale. Okay, that's a little bit bigger pattern that you're going to learn in the future. I recommend that you learn all your scales. You've probably heard piano players doing that for years and years on end. Okay, but so far we've learned just the first 5 notes. Now let me quickly find that major scale again without teaching it to you. I'm just going to play it. 4, 5, 6, 7. What's the 7th note? The 7th note of the C major scale was a B, right? Which is a half step below the root. Because remember, there's a C here, and since we're building the scale on C, this is also a root. So the 7th note is a half step below the root. Okay, that's a major 7 right there. Now, to find the major 7 of any scale, you could play the whole scale and find the 7th, or you could simply just say it's a half step below the root and play it up here if you need to. That's a real quick trick to find the major 7. The dominant 7th is a whole step below the root. Now that 7th is derived from a different scale. It's not the intent of this course to teach you all those different scales, but just know that that comes from another scale. Okay? And the minor 7 chord uses a minor triad and that same 7th.